The day Mei Lin arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878, she weighed less than the grief she carried, and the whole town knew it. She stepped off the Santa Fe railway coach like a woman who had forgotten how to take up space in the world, shoulders folded inward, cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows, the black mourning fabric of her dress hanging loose around a frame that had once been fuller, softer, alive with the kind of warmth that a good marriage and a good life can give a woman. But her husband, Wei Dong, was 6 months in the ground, buried beneath the yellow Kansas soil after a fever took him so fast that Mei Lin had not even had time to say a proper goodbye. One evening he was coughing, by morning he was gone, and in the weeks and months that followed, Mei Lin had simply stopped eating. Not out of a desire to punish herself, but because hunger, like joy, like the sound of her own laughter, had simply ceased to exist in the hollow place where her heart used to beat. She was 26 years old, and she looked like a woman who had already lived 3 lifetimes. Caldwell in 1878 was a rough-edged cattle town sitting right at the Kansas Indian Territory border, a place that smelled of horse manure and ambition in equal measure, where cowboys thundered through the main street with their spurs ringing and their mouths full of profanity, where the saloons never truly closed, and where a Chinese widow traveling alone was the kind of thing that made people stop and stare with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. The Chinese Exclusion Act had not yet been passed. That ugliness was still 4 years away, but the sentiment that would eventually produce it was already thick in the air of towns like Caldwell, places where men who had nothing liked to reassure themselves that at least they had more than someone. Mei Lin did not look left or right as she walked down the main street with her single trunk being wheeled behind her by a boy she had paid 50 cents. She had come to Caldwell because Wei Dong's brother, Chen, ran a small laundry there, and Chen had written to her in San Francisco after Wei died and told her she had a place with him and his wife if she needed it. She had needed it. She had needed it desperately, though she would never have said so out loud. Chen's laundry was on the south end of the main street, wedged between a tack shop and a barber, and when Mei Lin pushed open the door, the steam and the smell of hot lye soap hit her like a memory. Chen's wife, a round-faced woman named Hua, who was heavily pregnant with her second child, came around the ironing board and pulled Mei Lin into an embrace that was fiercer and warmer than anything Mei Lin had felt in months. "You are too thin," Hua said immediately, pulling back and looking at Mei Lin with eyes full of alarm. "You are so thin, Mei Lin. Did you eat anything on the train?" "I ate," Mei Lin said, which was not entirely true. She had eaten half a biscuit somewhere in Missouri and convinced herself it was enough. "You did not eat," Hua said flatly, in the tone of a woman who had raised one child and was preparing to raise a second and had no patience left for polite untruths. "Sit down. I am making congee." And so, Mei Lin's life in Caldwell began the way her life in San Francisco had ended, with a woman trying to feed her and Mei Lin sitting at a table not quite knowing how to be hungry anymore. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that was modest and quiet. Mei Lin helped in the laundry, learning the work quickly because she was sharp and her hands were strong despite everything. She took in the shirts of cowboys and the dresses of saloon girls without judgment, scrubbing and pressing and folding with a focused efficiency that Hua admired. The townspeople grew accustomed to her presence in the way that towns grow accustomed to things they cannot change, with a begrudging tolerance that stopped well short of warmth in most cases, though there were exceptions. Mrs. Albright from the general store always said good morning. The blacksmith, a large Irish man named Dermot, tipped his hat without fail. And old Mr. Patterson from the post office had once told her that her English was better than half the cowboys who came through his door, which was not exactly a compliment, but which Mei Lin had accepted in the spirit it was offered. But she remained thin, alarmingly so. Hua put food in front of her at every meal, rice porridge in the morning, noodle soup at midday, whatever could be made from the provisions available in a Kansas cattle town in 1878, which was often a creative exercise. And Mei Lin ate enough to stay upright, but never enough to fill the space her grief had carved out of her. Her cheeks stayed hollow, her wrists stayed narrow, the black dress kept on hanging. It was on a Wednesday morning in late October, when the Kansas sky had turned the particular sharp blue of early autumn, and the air had taken on the first real bite of coming cold, that Eli Cane came to the laundry. She heard him before she saw him, because a man his size had no choice but to announce himself simply by existing. The floorboards of the laundry gave a low groan under his boots, and then the doorframe filled with him so completely that the light from the street was almost entirely blocked, and Mei Lin looked up from the shirt she was pressing and saw, for the first time in her life, a man who looked as though he had been assembled by someone who simply did not know when to stop. Eli Cane was 32 years old, which Mei Lin did not know yet, and he was enormous in the specific way of men who work outdoors with their bodies every single day of their lives, not thick and soft like a merchant who eats well, but broad and dense and immovable, the kind of muscle that comes from hauling game down mountainsides and splitting wood in every season and wrestling the land itself into submission year after year. He stood well over 6 feet, his shoulders stretching the seams of a buffalo hide coat that had clearly been made for a large man, but was doing its best against the reality of Eli Cane. His hands, when he lifted one to pull off his hat, were enormous, scarred across the knuckles, rough as tree bark. And yet there was something in the deliberateness of the gesture, the care with which he removed the hat and tucked it against his chest, that suggested he was not entirely unaware of the impression he made on people. His hair was dark brown and fell to just below his jaw, not entirely tamed, the kind of hair that got that way from months in the mountains with nothing but a creek for a mirror. He had a jaw like quarried stone and eyes the particular green-gray of sage after rain, and there was a stillness in him that Mei Lin noticed immediately, not the stillness of a man with nothing going on inside, but the stillness of a man who had spent a very long time in wild places where noise could get you killed, and quiet was a form of intelligence. "Morning," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried. "I was told this is where a man can get his shirts laundered." "It is," Mei Lin said, setting down her iron. "How many shirts?" "4," he said, "and a pair of canvas trousers, if that's within your abilities." "It is within my abilities," she said, with a very slight edge that she could not entirely suppress, because she was tired of men coming into the laundry and phrasing their requests as though the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Eli Cane caught the edge, and something shifted in his expression, not offense, but something closer to amusement and perhaps a small measure of respect. He set a bundle down on the counter and began unfolding it with those enormous hands, and Mei Lin came around to assess the damage. The shirts were frontier dirty in the way that meant a man who worked genuinely hard, not casual trail dust, but the deep-set grime of a man who had been living rough for weeks. "Mountain man?" she asked without looking up, because the buffalo coat and the hair and the particular smell of wood smoke and pine resin that came off him had already answered the question. "More or less," he said. "I trap in the winter, come down to town to sell pelts, pick up supplies," he paused, "and apparently get my shirts washed." "How long will you be in Caldwell?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. He looked around the laundry with the slightly puzzled air of a man who did not spend much time in rooms with steam irons and starch tubs. "This your place?" "My brother-in-law's," she said. "My name is Mei Lin. The shirts will be ready in 2 days." "Eli Cane," he said, and he extended one of those enormous scarred hands across the counter. It was not something cowboys usually did with the Chinese laundress, and Mei Lin looked at the hand for just a fraction of a second before she took it. His grip was careful in the way of a man who knows perfectly well how much force he has and makes a constant conscious choice not to use it. 2 days then, he said. He came back in 2 days, the shirts were ready. He paid without argument, which not all customers did. He picked up the shirts, and then he stood there for a moment in the doorway with his hat back on his head, and Mei Lin noticed that he was looking at her the way Hua looked at her, with that particular alert concern that she had come to recognize as the face people made when they could not quite believe how thin she was. "There a good eating place in this town?" he asked. "Weston's has decent food," she said, "on the north end of Main Street." "What do you eat?" he asked, and the directness of it was so unexpected that for a moment Mei Lin just looked at him. "I beg your pardon?" "You look like you haven't had a square meal in a while," he said. He said it without cruelty, without apology, the way a man states an observable fact of the landscape. "I was just wondering where the food around here is worth eating." "I eat here," she said, which was true enough. He nodded slowly. the way a man nods when he's heard an answer but has not necessarily accepted it as the full truth. Then he left, and Mei Lin went back to the ironing board, and she told herself firmly that the peculiar feeling in her chest was simply the cold air that had come in when he opened the door. She was wrong, but she did not know that yet. He came back the following morning with 2 more shirts, which she strongly suspected were not actually dirty. She took them without comment. He paid her, and then lingered again in the way that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him, that particular brand of unhurried masculine stillness that seemed to fill whatever space he occupied and show no particular hurry to leave it. "I went to Weston's last night," he said. "How was it?" "Steak was decent," he said. "Nothing special." He paused, and those gray-green eyes settled on her with a directness that was somehow different from the way other men looked at her. Not assessing, not hostile, not the uncomfortable gaze she sometimes got from cowboys who seemed unsure whether to treat her as a curiosity or an obstacle. Eli Cane looked at her the way he probably looked at everything, which was to say clearly and without pretense. "I think you should come with me tonight," he said. Mei Lin blinked. "I'm sorry?" "To eat," he said. "To Weston's. They have a better cut on Fridays." I asked. "The owner, fellow named Weston, told me he gets a fresh delivery Thursday nights." "Mr. Cane," she said carefully. "Eli," he said. "Mr. Cane," she said again with gentle firmness. "I appreciate the offer, but I eat with my family here." "Is that what you're calling half a bowl of rice?" he said, and his voice was perfectly even, not unkind, but entirely devoid of the polite pretense that she usually used as a shield. She stared at him. "How do you—" "Hua told me," he said simply. Mei Lin felt a complicated rush of emotion that she could not immediately identify, except that one component of it was definitely irritation directed at her sister-in-law. She had no right. "She is worried about you," he said. "She said you have not eaten properly since your husband died." He held her gaze steadily. "I'm sorry about your husband." The simplicity of that, not the practiced, careful condolences she had been receiving for 6 months, the elaborate expressions of sympathy that always seemed to be more about the person offering them than about Mei Lin's actual grief. Just those 4 flat, honest words sat down in her chest like a warm stone. "Thank you," she said after a moment. "Come to Weston's tonight," he said again. "You do not have to talk to me if you do not want to. I will order the food and you can eat it in silence, and that is perfectly fine with me. But you should eat a proper meal." She almost said no. She had the word right there, shaped and ready. Then she looked at him, at the genuine, uncomplicated straightforwardness of those gray-green eyes, at the lack of any motive she could find beyond the stated one, and she heard herself say, "Fine, but I will be back by 8. 8 o'clock, he agreed, as if that had always been the plan, and he settled his hat on his head and walked out into the autumn afternoon, and Mei Lin put down the shirt she had been twisting in her hands without realizing it, and took a very careful breath. Hua, who had been invisible somewhere in the back room throughout this entire exchange, appeared instantly the moment the door closed, her round face arranged in an expression of studied innocence that did not fool either of them for a single second. "You told him," Mei Lin said. "He asked how you were getting on in Caldwell," Hua said serenely, moving to the stove to check on whatever she was simmering. I simply answered honestly. "You told a stranger about my eating habits." "I told a kind man who was clearly worried about you a thing that he clearly already suspected," Hua corrected. "And you said yes, which is the important part." She looked over her shoulder, and her expression softened into something genuine. "Mei Lin, you need to eat. You need to eat real food. And if it takes a large, handsome mountain man to sit across from you and make sure it happens, then I am grateful for him." "He is not," Mei Lin began, and then stopped, because she was not entirely sure how to finish that sentence in a way that was completely honest. "He is very handsome," Hua said cheerfully, turning back to the stove. "Even Chen said so, and Chen does not notice such things." Mei Lin went back to her ironing and said nothing, but she was aware, in a way that was not entirely unpleasant, that for the first time in 6 months, she was thinking about what she was going to wear. Weston's Steakhouse was the best restaurant in Caldwell, which was not saying a great deal in 1878 Kansas, but it was saying something. It occupied a wide room above the main street, reached by a wooden staircase on the outside of the building, and on Friday evenings it filled with cattlemen celebrating the end of a drive, and their wives dressed in their best, and occasionally a judge or a land agent in from Wichita. And the smell of cooking beef drifted down into the street and mixed with the cold autumn air in a way that was genuinely wonderful. Eli was waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs. He had changed. A clean shirt, dark wool, the buffalo coat traded for a slightly less enormous canvas coat, his hair combed back, though it still had that wild quality that she suspected was simply permanent. He was, she acknowledged privately, and without particular enthusiasm for the admission, the most physically impressive person she had ever seen. He made the men walking in and out of the saloon across the street look approximate, like rough sketches of the human form compared to the finished version standing in front of her. "You came," he said, with what seemed like genuine relief, which touched her in a small, unexpected way. "I said I would," she replied. He held the door at the top of the stairs for her, not in the performative way some men did, making a great show of gallantry, but simply and practically because he had arrived there first and it was the thing to do. The restaurant was warm inside, firelight and lamp oil, the smell of food so strong that Mei Lin's stomach, to her own surprise, responded with an actual physical pang of hunger. It was the first time in months that she had experienced that sensation unmixed with guilt, and she stood there for just a moment taking stock of it. The hostess, a young woman with a quick smile, showed them to a table near the window, and Mei Lin was aware of the looks they drew. A Chinese woman and an enormous mountain man were not a common sight in Weston's or anywhere else in Caldwell. But Eli seemed entirely unbothered by this, settling into his chair with the unconcerned ease of a man who had never particularly cared what strangers thought of him, and gradually Mei Lin found she could adopt a little of his indifference. "What do you recommend?" she asked, looking at the handwritten menu board on the wall. "The beef," he said without hesitation. "Weston told me he had a particular cut last night, a bone-in ribeye, and he should have more today. You should eat that." "That is a very large piece of meat," she said. "You need a very large piece of meat," he said with perfect seriousness. She looked at him, and despite herself, something shifted in her expression, a tiny, involuntary warming at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. "You are very direct," she said. "I've spent most of the last 10 years in the mountains," he said. "There isn't much cause for indirection up there. Things are mostly what they are." He poured water from the pitcher on the table and set a glass in front of her. "Is that bothersome?" "No," she said slowly. "Actually, no, it is not." He nodded, satisfied, and picked up his own menu, and there was a comfortable quality to the silence that followed, not the silence of two strangers with nothing to say, but something more spacious than that. When the food came, it was transcendent by the standards of a Kansas cattle town in 1878. The steak arrived on a heavy iron plate, sizzling still, a great thick slab of beef with the bone gleaming and the fat rendered to gold around the edges, and the smell of it hit Mei Lin somewhere deep and animal, below the level of thought. Eli had also ordered her potatoes and something green that turned out to be boiled greens with butter and fresh bread still warm from the oven. "Go ahead," he said simply, cutting into his own steak. She had not eaten a meal like this since before Wei died, since before Wei got sick, if she was honest. The last year of his life had been consumed by the cost of his treatment, by the anxiety of it, by the way illness shrinks the whole world down to the size of a sickbed. And somewhere in there, the simple pleasure of a good meal had stopped existing for her. She cut a piece of steak and put it in her mouth, and the taste of it, rich and savory and deeply, warmly real, broke something loose in her that she had not known was sealed up tight. She chewed slowly, and she swallowed, and she cut another piece, and she ate it, and she kept eating, not frantically but steadily, with a focus that surprised her, as though her body had been waiting for exactly this moment to remember what it was supposed to do. Eli said nothing. He ate his own food with the methodical appreciation of a man accustomed to long stretches of trail provisions and appreciating accordingly, and he did not make a single comment about the fact that Mei Lin was eating, did not watch her eat, did not do anything that might have made the moment self-conscious or strange. He simply ate and let her eat, and occasionally refilled her water glass, and when the bread basket emptied, he signaled the waitress for more without asking whether she wanted it. It was, Mei Lin realized, somewhere in the middle of her second piece of bread with butter, the most thoughtful thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. When they had both finished, and the plates were cleared, and Eli had paid without giving her the opportunity to argue about it, they sat for a moment in the warm lamplight of the restaurant, while the noise of a Friday evening, Caldwell, went on around them. "Can I ask you something?" Mei Lin said. "Go ahead." "Why are you doing this?" She held his gaze steadily. "You don't know me. You came to have your shirts washed, and you've now taken me to dinner and made sure I ate a full meal. I would like to understand the reason, or—" He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that he was giving the question genuine consideration rather than reaching for the easiest answer. "When I first came down off the mountains 8 years ago," he said, "I wasn't in a good way. I'd been up there for a year on my own, and I'd stopped taking care of myself properly. Not because anything bad had happened exactly, just because when you're alone long enough, you start to forget that you're worth the trouble." He paused and looked at the table and looked back up at her. "A woman in a town in Colorado, a baker's wife. She sat me down and made me eat a full meal, and then another one. And she was plain about the fact that it was what I needed, and that I was going to do it. It changed something." He was quiet again. "I suppose I recognize the look." Mei Lin was silent for a long moment. Outside, a group of cowboys went by in the street below, boots loud on the boardwalk, voices raised in the particular way of men who had been drinking since mid-afternoon. "Wei died 6 months ago," she said. She had not said those words to anyone who was not already inside her grief with her, and they felt strange in her mouth. Not bad strange, but real in a way that was different from before. "He was 30 years old. A fever. 3 days. She stopped. "That's a very fast thing to lose someone," Eli said quietly. "Yes," she said. "It was." They sat with that for a moment, and it did not feel like an uncomfortable silence. It felt like a respectful one, like two people allowing a real thing to exist in the space between them without trying to paper over it. "I should get back," she said eventually. "I'll walk you," he said, standing immediately and offering his hand to help her up from her chair. Just a practical gesture. The table was close and the chair awkward, but his hand was warm, and when she stood, he did not let go for just 1 extra second. And then he did, and they walked back down the wooden stairs into the cold Kansas night. He walked beside her down the main street toward the laundry, and she was aware of the way the street seemed to shift slightly around him, cowboys stepping aside without quite realizing they were doing it, a kind of unconscious deference to a man who simply occupied more of the world than most. She had always had to navigate streets carefully, take less space than she wanted, hold herself ready for the small daily indignities of being Chinese and female in a place that had not particularly asked for either. Walking next to Eli Cane was different. The street did not press in. "Thank you," she said at the laundry door, "for dinner and for—" She stopped, not sure exactly how to name what she was thanking him for. "You will come again," he said. It was not entirely a question. She looked at him in the lamplight, the great quiet bulk of him, the serious gray-green eyes, the simple honest face of a man who said what he meant and meant what he said. "You come in for your shirts on Monday," she said, which was not a no, and they both knew it. The smile that crossed his face was brief and real and entirely worth the wait. The days that followed established a pattern that neither of them designed, but both of them chose. Eli came to the laundry every few days, sometimes with shirts, sometimes with nothing at all, which he never bothered to explain, and Mei Lin never bothered to question. He would lean against the counter and they would talk, and the talk was easy and genuine and often surprising, because Eli Cane had lived a life so different from anything she had known that listening to him describe it was like hearing dispatches from another world. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer, left at 17 to go west because the farm had not been big enough to contain either his body or his ambitions. He had trapped in the Rockies, spent 2 winters with a Cheyenne band in the high country who had taught him things about surviving cold and darkness that he said had saved his life more than once. He had crossed the desert on foot when his horse died in Nevada, survived on water from cactus and what small game he could catch. He had seen things, country so beautiful it made a man feel small in the best possible way, storms so violent they remade the landscape overnight, and he described all of it without embellishment in the same plain, straightforward voice he used for everything. And somehow that made it more extraordinary rather than less. Mei Lin, for her part, told him about San Francisco, which she described as both the most and least like China of any American city. And he listened with the focused attention of a man who did not do anything halfway. She told him about the Tang neighborhood where she and Wei had lived, about the food stalls and the sound of Cantonese on every corner, about the fog that came in every afternoon and turned the whole world soft and gray. She told him about coming to America as a girl of 14 with her parents, who had been workers on the Transcontinental Railroad until her father was injured in a blast and came away with one arm and a settlement that was barely enough to set up the small shop her mother had run until she died. She did not tell him everything yet. There were things still pressed too tight in her chest, but she told him more than she had told anyone in Caldwell, and each conversation left her feeling, obscurely but distinctly, more like herself than she had felt in months. And she ate. Every Friday evening, Eli came to the laundry door at 6 o'clock and walked her to Weston's. She ate the steak he ordered for her, always the best cut available, which he inquired about with Weston or whoever was working before they sat down, and the potatoes and the bread and whatever else was on offer, and her body began, slowly and steadily, to take back what grief had borrowed from it. The sharpness in her face began to soften. The hollows under her cheekbones began to fill. Her wrists were still narrow, but there was substance to them again, a realness, and Hua watched this transformation with the satisfaction of a woman who had been right about exactly the thing she thought she was right about. "He is in love with you already," Hua said one morning, not looking up from the shirt she was mending. "That is an absurd statement," Mei Lin said. "It is an observable fact," Hua said. "He comes here every other day, and he is not, frankly, a man who needs his shirts washed that often. He watches you when you are not looking at him, and he looks very serious and very happy at the same time, which is exactly what being in love looks like." She paused. "Are you in love with him?" "I'm not going to answer that," Mei Lin said, moving to the washtub with great determination. Hua smiled at the shirt she was mending and said nothing more, because she already had her answer. The truth was, and Mei Lin knew it, even if she was not yet ready to say it to anyone including herself, that she thought about Eli Cane more or less constantly. She thought about the way his eyes changed when he was amused, the gray-green shifting to something almost warm. She thought about the way he held doors without making it a production. She thought about his hands, those remarkable scarred hands, and how carefully he used them. She thought about the night he had walked her home through a rainstorm and simply handed her his enormous coat without a word, so matter-of-fact about it that she had not even thought to protest, and how she had given it back to him damp, and he had put it back on still damp without complaint. She thought about the fact that he looked at her, really looked at her with all of his considerable attention, in a way that made her feel both completely seen and completely safe at the same time, which was a combination she had not previously understood was possible. She thought about Wei too. She always thought about Wei. But she was beginning to understand, in the way that a person gradually understands something they have been resistant to, that loving Eli was not the same as losing Wei, and that the living continued to need things that only the living could give, and that Wei, who had been a man of fundamental decency, would not have wanted her to starve herself into the earth beside him. The crisis, when it came, arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, cold and bright, when three men Mei Lin had never seen before came into the laundry while Chen was at the supplier's, and Hua was upstairs resting, and stood in a loose half-circle that blocked the door with a purposefulness that made every instinct Mei Lin possessed go quiet and sharp at the same time. The one who did the talking was a thin man with a reddish mustache and the particular flat eyes of someone who had decided that the rules were for other people. His name was Denton, she would learn later, a former cattle hand who had been run off 2 different operations for stealing and who spent his time in the margins of Caldwell looking for whatever he could take. "We've decided we don't want a Celestial running a business on this street," Denton said, leaning on the counter with his elbow in a way that was studied and deliberate. "Makes the street look bad." "This is my brother-in-law's business," Mei Lin said. Her voice came out even, which she was proud of. Registered legally with the county. If you have a dispute—" "We don't want a dispute," Denton said, and smiled in a way that had no warmth in it at all. "We just want you to understand how things are going to be." One of the other men began moving toward the back of the laundry, toward the cash box, and Mei Lin moved to cut him off, a reflex, not a plan, and Denton's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, and she had one sharp second of genuine fear before the door opened. The sound of three men's attention shifting at once was something she registered rather than heard. Denton let go of her wrist. She turned. Eli filled the doorway in the way he always filled doorways, completely and without apology, and he was not in the calm, unhurried state she was accustomed to. He was very still in a different way now, the stillness of something with considerable force behind it at rest. His eyes went from Mei Lin to Denton's hand, and the reddened mark it had left on her wrist, and something moved across his face that was quiet and absolute, and more frightening, she suspected, than whatever Denton had intended to use on her. "You'll want to step back from her," Eli said, and his voice was so completely level that it was somehow louder than shouting would have been. Denton was a fool in the way that small, dangerous men can be fools. He had enough confidence in his own threat to mistake it for actual capability. He sized Eli up with the flat-eyed calculation of a man who had never been truly tested and said, "This doesn't concern you, mountain man." "It concerns me," Eli said simply. What happened next was brief and not particularly dramatic from a narrative standpoint, which was to say that three men left the laundry considerably faster than they had entered it, and Denton left with a bruised jaw, and his companion left without his hat, and the third man left without what remained of his dignity, and Eli stood in the doorway and watched them go down the street until they were out of sight, and then he turned and looked at Mei Lin. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The absolute steadiness of his voice was back, as though the last 30 seconds had not happened. "I'm fine," she said. Her hands were shaking, she noticed with detached interest. "My wrist." He was across the room in 2 strides, and he took her hand in both of his with a gentleness so complete and so at odds with what she had just witnessed that it knocked the breath out of her. He turned her wrist in the light, examined the red marks Denton's fingers had left, pressed his thumb carefully against the pulse point. "Not broken," he said, "just bruised." He didn't put her hand down. He kept holding it, both of his enormous hands wrapped around her small one, and he looked at her face with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and alarmed that he was not trying to conceal. "Mei Lin," he said. "I am fine," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she intended, because the shaking from her hands had moved somewhere closer to her chest. "Eli, I am fine." "You shouldn't be here alone," he said, "not without Chen." "I am here every day," she said. "This is my work." "I know that," he said, and he was very careful, she noticed, not to say what she could hear him thinking, that it was not safe, that she was not safe, that he wanted— "Eli," she said softly. "Yes," he said, and then, because there did not seem to be anywhere else for it to go, he pulled her in, very gently, and with the care of a man acutely conscious of his own size and strength, and held her against his chest, and she let him, because the shaking needed somewhere to go, and his chest was warm and solid and absolutely reliable in a way she had forgotten things could be. She stood there for a long moment, one hand pressed against his shirt, feeling the slow, steady drum of his heartbeat and the warmth radiating off him like a banked fire, and the shaking gradually subsided. When she stepped back, he let her go immediately. No reluctance, no attempt to prolong it, and she was grateful for that. "Thank you," she said, "for coming when you did." "I came to see if you wanted coffee," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, the slight rough quality to his voice, that told her the ordinariness of the statement was somewhat manufactured. "You came to see if I wanted coffee," she repeated. "I was across the street at the hardware store and I saw them go in," he admitted, and the plain honesty of it made her smile, properly smile, a real full smile that she felt in her face and her chest and her fingertips. "Stay for a while," she said. "I will make the coffee." He sat down on the stool by the counter. It was really 2 stools pushed together. One was never quite enough for Eli Cane, and watched her move around the small back kitchen with those gray-green eyes. and she was aware of his gaze with the particular warmth of a woman who is aware that the person watching her is doing so because they find her genuinely remarkable, not because she is a curiosity or a spectacle. It was different from other kinds of attention. It settled instead of pressing. "Eli," she said with her back to him, measuring coffee into the pot. "Yes." "When you leave Caldwell," she said carefully. "What do you—" She stopped. "When do I leave Caldwell?" he said quietly. "I know your season, the trapping. You'll go back to the mountains." He was quiet for a long moment, and she brought the coffee to the small table and sat across from him and looked at him directly, because she was a woman who, when she finally decided to look at a thing clearly, did so without flinching. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "Have you?" "I've been thinking that there might be reasons to spend more time in town." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "Specifically this town. The heat in the laundry, the smell of clean linen, the sound of the street outside. It all continued as it always had, and Mei Lin sat with her coffee and looked at the man across from her and felt something she had not felt in more than a year settle into its proper place in her chest. "I think," she said slowly, that would be acceptable." He looked at her with those direct, honest, warm, gray-green eyes, and for the first time since she had known him, the stillness in him was not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of something genuinely, deeply happy. November became December, and December brought cold that came howling off the open Kansas plains with a violence that surprised people who had not experienced a genuine prairie winter. And Caldwell hunkered down under gray skies and frozen mud, and the particular interior quality of life that comes when outdoor movement becomes an exercise in determination. Eli stayed. He helped Chen repair a broken wall in the back of the laundry one Saturday morning, showing up before anyone asked with tools and materials he had sourced from Dermot's hardware store, working alongside Chen in companionable silence while Mei Lin and Hua watched from the doorway with expressions carefully calibrated to appear less pleased than they were. Eli and Chen had developed the slightly formal but genuinely warm friendship of two men who respected each other without entirely understanding each other's world. And Chen had told Mei Lin quietly one evening that he thought Eli was a good man, which from Chen was roughly equivalent to a speech. In the evenings, when the laundry was closed and the cold pushed everyone indoors, Eli would come, and they would sit at the kitchen table with the lamps turned up and the stove going, and Mei Lin would teach him a little Cantonese. He was hopelessly bad at the tones, but he tried with such earnest good humor that it was impossible not to find it endearing. And he would tell her about the mountains in winter, the specific quality of silence that exists above 9,000 feet when 2 feet of new snow have fallen overnight, and the way the cold was so pure up there that it didn't feel hostile, just absolute. "Did you ever want to stay up there?" she asked one evening. "Permanently. Never come back to town?" He thought about that, his coffee cooling in front of him. "There were years when it seemed possible," he said, "when the mountains were enough." He looked at her across the table. "They're less enough lately." She looked back at him, and the firelight was very warm, and outside, the prairie wind was asking questions about the windows, and she felt the specific and unmistakable weight of a moment that had been building toward something and had arrived. "Eli," she said. "Mei Lin," he said. "I'm not entirely sure," she said, very carefully, "that I'm ready to be in love again." "I know," he said. "But I think I might be becoming something close to it," she said, "with you, despite my best efforts to the contrary." Something in his face opened like a door coming off a latch. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand and held his, and they sat like that in the warm kitchen for a long time, and outside, the Kansas wind blew, and the prairie was vast and cold and indifferent, and inside, the warmth was entirely their own. He kissed her for the first time 3 days later, on the boardwalk outside the laundry in the early morning when the frost was still on the planks, and their breath made small clouds in the air, after she had said something that made him laugh, a real laugh, deep and surprised and genuine, different from his usual reserved half-smile. And when the laugh had subsided, he had looked at her with an expression of such open affection that she had leaned up and kissed him before quite deciding to, and he'd kissed her back with the same care and deliberateness he brought to everything, both hands coming up to frame her face with the same tender precision he used when he had examined her wrist after Denton grabbed her, and the kiss lasted approximately 3 seconds, and was, Mei Lin thought afterward, the realest 3 seconds she had experienced in more than a year. Hua, who had been watching from the window, immediately went to find Chen. December brought Hua's baby, a boy, healthy and loud, whom they named Daming, which meant bright light, and Mei Lin held him in the kitchen on the night he was born, and felt something shift in her that she could not name except to say it was warm and forward-looking, the first feeling she had had in a long time that leaned toward the future rather than the past. Christmas in Caldwell in 1878 was modest by most standards, a church service, some decorating of the main street with pine boughs, the saloons doing brisk business in the evenings from men who had no family near. Eli spent Christmas Eve at the laundry for dinner, which Hua had prepared with the determined festivity of a woman who had recently had a baby and had decided the world was going to be joyful whether it wanted to be or not. There was roast chicken and rice and a kind of sweet steamed pudding that Hua had adapted from a recipe she half remembered from Shanghai, and Eli ate 3 helpings of everything with an enthusiasm that delighted Hua beyond all proportion, and Mei Lin watched him across the table holding baby Daming with the kind of natural easiness that large men who are genuinely gentle often have with small things. The baby seemed entirely unintimidated, looking up at Eli's large face with a philosophical infant expression, and she felt something in the vicinity of her heart do a thing she had been expecting for some time. She loved him. She loved him quite completely and without remainder, and the realization sat in her chest not as a sudden shock, but as the acknowledgement of something that had been true for a while and was simply now being admitted to consciousness. She told him that night, outside in the cold after dinner, standing on the boardwalk with the stars hard and bright over the flat Kansas dark. "I love you," she said, looking up at him with her breath-making clouds in the cold air. "I want you to know that. I love you." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see that he was affected, genuinely, deeply affected, in the way that a man who has taught himself to need very little is affected when he is given something he had not quite let himself believe was available to him. "Mei Lin," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I know," she said, reaching up to touch his jaw. "I know." He turned his head and pressed his lips against her palm, and then he looked at her with those clear, honest eyes. "I have been in love with you," he said carefully, "since the morning you told me that laundering a pair of canvas trousers was within your abilities." She laughed, a full, real laugh that she felt from her chest down to her toes, a laugh that belonged to the woman she was becoming again, rather than the woman she had been afraid she was turning into. And he smiled back at her, and he pulled her in close and held her against the warmth of his chest in the cold winter night, and the stars were very bright, and the prairie went on forever in every direction, vast and indifferent and beautiful, and none of it mattered as much as what was happening right there on that boardwalk. January arrived, and with it a stretch of genuine cold that shut the town in on itself and made even the hardiest Caldwell residents think longingly about fireplaces and blankets. Eli had, by this point, taken a room at the boarding house 2 streets over from the laundry. He had given up any pretense of being about to return to the mountains, which the boarding house owner, a widower named Sullivan, accepted without comment because Eli was quiet, and he paid his rent on time. And those were the only 2 qualities Sullivan required. He continued to take Mei Lin to Weston's on Friday evenings, and the steak continued to be excellent, and the gradual transformation that had been happening in Mei Lin over the preceding weeks had by January become undeniable. She'd been eating well for 2 months by then, real food and enough of it, Weston's steaks and Hua's cooking, and the biscuits that Eli occasionally bought from the bakery on his way to the laundry, which she was beginning to accept without the reflexive protest she had initially produced because it was easier than arguing with him, and also because she liked biscuits more than she had previously admitted to herself. The physical change was visible, unmistakable, and for the first time since Wei died, she looked in the mirror and saw herself, rather than the ghost she had been afraid of becoming. Her face had filled, the cheekbones still defined but no longer dangerously sharp. Her arms had substance again, her figure the natural curves that had characterized her before grief had stripped them away, and she moved through the laundry and through the town with an energy and a groundedness that had been absent for so long that its return felt almost like meeting someone new. Hua kept catching her eye and smiling with a satisfaction so complete that it was practically radiant. "You look like yourself again," Hua told her one afternoon, standing in the kitchen after the lunch dishes were cleared. "I feel like myself again," Mei Lin said, and meant it absolutely. "A little better than yourself, I think," Hua said with her irrepressible frankness. "Grief is a terrible thing, but you were—" She stopped, and her face went soft. "You were disappearing, Mei Lin. I watched you disappearing, and I could not stop it. And now you are here, really here, and it is—" She stopped again. Mei Lin crossed the kitchen and hugged her sister-in-law, and Hua held on with the grip of a woman who had been frightened and was grateful. And baby Daming, sitting on his blanket in the corner, made the small, cheerful sound he made when he felt the warmth of the room shift toward something good. The question of what exactly was going to happen between her and Eli, the practical, real question, not the emotional one, which had been answered on the boardwalk in December, had been present between them in the way that real questions exist between two honest people, not avoided, just waited on until the right moment. It came on a Sunday afternoon in mid-January, when the cold had briefly relented and a thin winter sunshine came through the laundry windows and laid long rectangles of pale gold across the floor. Eli had come in the early afternoon, and Chen had taken Hua and Daming to visit a family they knew on the other side of town, and it was just Mei Lin and Eli in the quiet of the laundry, sitting at the work table with coffee, and the quality of the afternoon felt suspended, like a breath being held. "I want to talk to you about something," Eli said. "All right," she said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, and she noticed, with a tenderness that had become familiar, that he was nervous. She could always tell because the stillness in him became a slightly different quality of stillness, more effortful than natural. "I've been thinking about the mountains," he said, "about trapping, about whether that is how I want to spend the rest of my life." She watched him carefully. "There are men making a living differently now," he said. "Land is opening up. There's cattle work here, real cattle work, not just wrangling but building something, a ranch, something that stays in one place." He paused. "I've talked to some men. There's land available 2 hours south of here. Good grass, a creek. I could build a house." "Eli," she said quietly. He looked at her directly. "I am asking you to marry me," he said, "if you will. I want to be clear that the house and the land and the—" He stopped, and the nervousness in his stillness reached a peak that was almost touching. "I'm not asking you to come with me. I'm asking you to let me build something with you, if you want that." The room was very quiet, and the pale winter sun lay on the floor between them, and Mei Lin looked at this man, this enormous, deliberate, honest, gentle man who had walked into her life with a bundle of dirty shirts and had quietly, methodically, refused to let her disappear, and felt the future arranging itself around her like something not just possible but actual. "I want that," she said. He exhaled, a long, slow breath that carried 6 weeks of tension with it, and something entirely different from his usual composed expression moved across his face, relief and joy, and something softer and more private than either. "I want to ask Chen," he said, "properly." "He will say yes," she said. "He's very fond of you." "I would still like to ask," Eli said. She smiled. "I know," she said, and she reached across the table and took his hand, and he held it in both of his in the way he always did, that careful, encompassing warmth. The spring thaw came early to southern Kansas that year, 1879, arriving in March on the back of a warm southern wind that turned the frozen mud to real mud, and then, gradually, to something that was beginning to look like land again. Chen had said yes to Eli with a formality and warmth that had reduced Hua to happy tears and made even Chen blink somewhat rapidly. And by the end of March, the small gold ring that Eli had commissioned from the jeweler in Wichita, a 3-day round trip that he made without telling Mei Lin, and returned from covered in trail dust, presenting the ring to her in the kitchen after supper with an endearing lack of ceremony, simply opening the small box and looking at her with those clear, honest eyes, was on her left hand. They were married in April in the small church at the north end of Caldwell by a minister named Reverend Hayes, who had married half the cattle town and was as practical and unromantic about the institution as Kansas weather, which suited both Eli and Mei Lin perfectly well. Hua was the witness, with baby Daming on her hip and tears streaming unabashedly down her face, and Chen stood beside Eli with the careful, upright dignity of a man who felt the importance of the moment deeply and was going to hold himself together or know the reason why. The church was small and plain, and the April wind knocked against the windows, and the ceremony was brief and real. And when Mei Lin stood beside Eli at the altar and looked up at him, and he looked down at her with that expression she had come to recognize as the one he used only for her, that open, certain, entirely unguarded look that said everything he was. She felt the last locked thing in her come open and stay that way. They spent one night in Caldwell, at the boarding house where Sullivan had made a small effort at festivity by putting a jar of wildflowers on the hall table. And in the morning they loaded Eli's wagon with everything they owned, which for Eli was tools, traps he planned to sell, his rifle, and the accumulated domesticity of a man who had been living in a boarding house and had quietly begun acquiring things like a set of decent plates and a good iron skillet in anticipation of a different kind of life. And for Mei Lin was her trunk, Hua's careful packing of what could be managed in the way of kitchen provisions, a quilted blanket that had been Wei's mother's and which she would keep always, and a small wooden box with a portrait of her parents and a photograph of Wei. Because the dead come with us wherever we go, and that is not a complication, but simply the nature of love. The land Eli had bought was 2 hours south of Caldwell, along a creek called Mule Creek that ran clear and cold through a stretch of country that was, in the April light, absolutely beautiful in the wide, empty way of Kansas. Grass coming back green from the winter, the creek lined with cottonwoods just beginning to show leaf, and a view in every direction of sky and open country that made Mei Lin, who had spent years in San Francisco, pressed close by buildings on all sides, catch her breath. The cabin that Eli had spent his February and March building, and she had not entirely understood what this meant until she saw it, was solid and well made, not large but properly constructed, with a real stone fireplace and 2 real windows and a wood floor that he had planed smooth himself, and a kitchen area with a proper stove, and out back a well he had dug by hand over the course of several February days that Mei Lin would later describe as legendary. He had clearly thought carefully about what she would need to live and work comfortably in it, and the care embedded in every practical choice moved her so completely that she stood in the doorway for a long moment and could not speak. "It needs things," he said from behind her, looking at it over her shoulder with a practical eye. "Curtains, better furniture. There's more to be done." "Eli," she said. "Yes." "It is perfect," she said. She turned and looked up at him. "You built this for me." "For us," he said, and the words settled between them with the specific weight of things that are newly true and entirely sure. The first summer on Mule Creek was hard work and almost entirely happy. Eli had 3 horses to start, plans for cattle in the fall, and a vegetable garden that Mei Lin laid out with a focus and expertise that surprised him, until she pointed out that she had been growing food in containers on a San Francisco balcony for 6 years, and this was simply a larger scale of the same principle. He built fence in the long summer days, and she cooked on the new stove, and they ate together at the table he built from timber he cut at the creek, and the food was extraordinary. Not because either of them was a particularly ambitious cook, but because everything tasted better on a table you had made, in a house you had built, with a person you loved and had chosen. They had visitors. Hua and Chen and Daming came in June for a week, and Hua spent the entire time examining the cabin and the garden with the systematic thoroughness of a woman, checking that everything was as it should be, pronouncing herself satisfied, and eating Eli's cooking. He made a beef stew on the first evening that reduced Hua to the kind of silence that is more eloquent than praise. A cattleman from the neighboring property, a rancher named Holt, who had been on the land for 5 years, came to introduce himself in the first month and was straightforwardly accepting in the way that some people in that time and place managed to be, which is to say, he looked at Mei Lin, shook her hand, complimented the garden, and came back 3 weeks later to buy 3 of Eli's horses, and from that point they were neighbors in the complete and practical sense of the word. There were harder moments too, because the West in 1879 was not a place that made any particular accommodation for idealism. There were men who came to the property with attitudes about the Chinese woman on Mule Creek that required Eli's size and steadiness to address, and address he always did, not with violence when it could be helped, but with the immovable certainty of a man who has decided exactly where he stands and cannot be moved from it. There was a week in August when a drought threatened the garden, and Mei Lin worked at the creek with buckets from dawn until the pain in her arms was so bad she could not lift them above her waist, and Eli came home to find her sitting by the creek with her hands in the cold water, and he sat down beside her without a word, and then went back to work because the garden needed it, working until the sun was entirely down and the garden survived. There were nights when the loneliness of the open country came in under the door, and Mei Lin lay awake listening to the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods and thought about San Francisco, and about Wei, and about the distance between who she had been and who she was now. And Eli always seemed to know. He would turn without waking and pull her close, one arm heavy and warm across her, and she would listen to his breathing and the wind together and find her way back to the present and to the warmth of what was real and hers. By late summer, Mei Lin suspected, and by early September she was certain, and she told Eli on a September evening when the light was turning the particular gold amber of late summer and the cottonwoods along the creek were beginning to show the first hints of yellow, standing outside the cabin with his supper in her hands, because she had been trying to find the right moment all day and had finally decided there was no right moment, only the present one. "I think we are having a baby," she said. He went completely still, not the working stillness, not the watchful stillness, but something new, a stillness she had never seen before, the stillness of a man who has just been given something so enormous he has not yet worked out how to contain it. "Are you certain?" he said, and his voice was different, lower and careful in a way that moved her. "Quite certain," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she had not expected. He laughed, the deep, surprised, genuine laugh she loved most, and he pulled her into his arms carefully, with the baby in between them like something already precious, and held her there in the September evening while the creek ran cold and clear and the cottonwoods whispered above them. "A baby," he said into her hair. "A baby," she confirmed. He held her tighter, and she pressed her face into his chest and felt his heartbeat against her forehead and the warmth of the late afternoon sun on her back, and thought that if she had tried, at the darkest point of her grief, to imagine a future that contained something like this, she could not have made it as real as what she was actually standing in. The autumn on Mule Creek was generous that year, as though the land itself had decided to make the point. The cattle Eli had bought in August were doing well on the creek grass. The garden had produced abundantly despite the August scare, and the root cellar was full. The first real frost came in October, and Eli had spent the preceding weeks laying in wood with an industriousness that Mei Lin secretly found deeply reassuring. She would look out the window and see him splitting logs in the cold morning air, the axe coming down with the complete efficiency of a man who knows exactly what his body can do, and has long since stopped being surprised by it, his breath making clouds, and feel an immense and private gratitude for the sheer solid reality of him. Hua wrote letters. Holt came by occasionally. The minister from Caldwell, Reverend Hayes, rode out in November to check that the Cane homestead was well, which Eli appreciated more than he showed, and Mei Lin found moving. Life in 1879 Kansas was not easy by any measurement, but it was full, and it was growing, and it was entirely theirs. Winter came in December with a seriousness that made the previous year's Caldwell cold seem preliminary. The creek froze solid, the prairie turned white and stayed white, and the wind from the north was so constant and so cold that it became a presence in the cabin in its own right, pressing at the windows, finding the gaps in the chinking that Eli repaired systematically, working its way under doors so that there were always 2 or 3 rugs deployed as draft stoppers. Mei Lin grew with the winter, her belly rounding in the way that had a particular grace to it, despite, or perhaps because of, everything, and she moved through the cabin with the deliberate care of a woman aware of the treasure she was carrying. Eli was attentive in the specific and practical way he was attentive to everything. He chopped extra wood and stacked it by the kitchen door so she never had to go out for it. He took over the heavier chores without discussion and without making a production of it. He read to her in the evenings from whatever books they had, and his reading voice, which was the same unhurried deep register as his speaking voice, was one of the best things she had ever heard. He worried, she could tell. Occasionally she would catch him watching her with that careful, assessing look, checking that she was eating enough, sleeping enough, that the color in her face was good and the energy in her eyes was what it should be. But he worried quietly, without communicating the worry in a way that would have burdened her. One January evening, deep in the cold of what was turning out to be one of the harder Kansas winters in recent memory, they sat by the fireplace after supper. Eli in the larger chair with a book, Mei Lin on the settle with her mending, her feet tucked under her and the fire very warm. And there was a quality to the silence between them that was so completely right that it seemed to Mei Lin like the physical proof of something. "Eli," she said. He looked up from his book. "Yes?" "Do you know that you saved my life?" she said. She said it simply, matter-of-factly, because it was a simple and matter-of-fact truth, and she wanted him to have it. He was quiet for a moment. "You saved your own life," he said. "I just made sure there was a stake in front of you." "That's not nothing," she said. "No," he agreed. "I suppose it isn't." He put the book down and looked at her with those clear, warm eyes. "You should know that you did something for me, too." "What did I do?" "You made me stop being a man who belonged only to the mountains," he said. "I had been that for a long time, and I think I had started to believe it was all I was capable of." He paused. "You showed me different." The fire crackled and settled, and outside the January wind pressed at the cabin, and Mei Lin looked at her husband, the remarkable, enormous, gentle, honest man she had somehow received when she was not even looking for him, and felt love is a physical thing, warm and solid and permanent, like good stone. Their son was born in May 1880 in the cabin on Mule Creek, delivered by a midwife from Caldwell who had made the 2-hour drive in a buckboard, because Eli had ridden to town at 5 in the morning when Mei Lin's labor began and had come back with Mrs. Alderman, who was 60 years old and had delivered approximately 200 children and had the unshakable serenity of a person for whom very little was surprising. The labor was long and difficult in the way that first labors often are, and Eli sat outside the cabin door through most of it, because Mrs. Alderman had instructed him firmly to stay out of the way, and he was following instructions with visible effort. And once or twice, Mei Lin, through the haze of labor, was aware of the particular quality of quiet that was Eli's presence just on the other side of a wall, large and still and absolutely there. The baby arrived in the late afternoon, into the golden May light that came through the west-facing window and lay across the bed in a warm stripe, and he announced himself with lungs that were entirely adequate, a sound so startlingly vigorous coming from something so small that Mrs. Alderman laughed with surprised appreciation. When Eli came in, at Mrs. Alderman's permission, given with the brisk satisfaction of a professional job well done, he stopped at the bedroom door and looked at Mei Lin in the bed with the small bundle in her arms, and something moved across his face that was entirely beyond words. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and Mei Lin placed the baby in his arms, this enormous man, those great scarred, careful hands cradling a thing so small and new and vital. And Eli Cane looked down at his son with an expression of such complete and unguarded love that Mei Lin felt tears on her face before she was even aware of crying. "Hello," Eli said to the baby. Quiet, direct, honest, the only way he knew to say anything. The baby looked up at him with the unfocused blue gaze of the newborn and made a small sound that was not quite anything yet, but was clearly the beginning of something. "He needs a name," Eli said, still looking at him. "I thought James," Mei Lin said. "James Wei Cane." Eli looked up at her, and she saw that he understood what the name meant, the honoring of what had come before within the building of what was new, and that he was entirely in favor of it. "James Wei Cane," he said, and looked back at the baby. "Hello, James." Mrs. Alderman, coming in with fresh water, observed the scene with the practiced eye of a woman who had seen this particular moment approximately 200 times and found it newly moving anyway. And she set down her water and went to make tea, and left the three of them in the late May light that came through the window and touched everything in the room with gold. James grew the way babies grow in good conditions, steadily and with constant surprise. He was a good-natured child from the beginning, with Eli's capacity for stillness and Mei Lin's quick dark eyes. And his first winter he spent observing the world from the position of his mother's arms or his father's enormous chest, with the philosophical equanimity of a person who has concluded from available evidence that the world is a basically satisfactory place. Eli was the kind of father that Mei Lin had hoped he would be, and had been privately certain he would be. Present, patient, careful, speaking to James in the plain, honest voice he used for everything, treating him from the beginning as a person rather than a category. The ranch grew as well. By the end of 1880, Eli had 20 head of cattle in a real working relationship with the cattlemen in the area, including Holt, who had become a genuine friend, a solid, practical man who brought his wife, Nora, to meet Mei Lin in the summer. And Nora had taken one look at Mei Lin's garden and announced that they needed to talk. And they had talked for 3 hours, and a friendship had formed that would last many years. Mei Lin had begun selling vegetables to the Caldwell General Store, Mrs. Albright's operation, who paid fairly and recommended her produce specifically. It was a small thing, but it was hers, and the independence of it, the fact of contributing to what they were building together from the skills and efforts of her own hands, mattered to her in a way she found difficult to articulate, but which Eli understood perfectly well, because he was a man who had always understood what it meant to need to make things with your own hands. Chen and Hua came for a long visit in the summer of 1881, by which time Daming was walking and talking with a fluency and volume that suggested he had inherited the best qualities of both his parents, and the cabin was full for a week in the particular warm way that it gets full when the people you love best are in it. Eli and Chen sat on the porch in the evenings after the children were in bed and talked about land and business and the future of Kansas in a way that was genuine and interested. And Mei Lin and Hua sat together in the kitchen and talked about everything, and occasionally both conversations would merge and be one conversation, and the summer evenings on Mule Creek with the cottonwoods rustling and the fireflies beginning and the creek running darkly below its banks were as good as evenings get. The trouble that had found them in Caldwell, the flat-eyed hostility of men like Denton, the daily small injustices of being Chinese and female in the frontier West, had not entirely disappeared. It was the nature of the time and the place, and Mei Lin knew better than to expect it to be otherwise. But on Mule Creek, on their own land, something about the scale of the world was different. The country itself did not care about the things small men cared about. The creek ran regardless. The grass came back in spring regardless. The sky was the same sky above everyone, and it was enormous, and in the face of that enormity, the petty measures men used to diminish other men seemed revealed for the small things they were. When Mei Lin stood in her garden in the early morning and looked out over the creek and the open country beyond, she felt the particular freedom of a woman who has built something real and inhabits it fully, and that feeling was stronger than anything that could be said to her in town. By the spring of 1882, she was expecting again. She told Eli on an April morning, almost exactly 3 years from when they had first arrived at the cabin together, standing in the same spot by the creek where he had held her after the news of James. He was the same stillness, the same overwhelmed quiet, the same deep, genuine laugh when it broke through, and she thought that this constant renegotiation of joy, the same feeling finding new forms, was perhaps the most essential thing about loving someone well over time. Their daughter was born in November 1882, small and fierce and immediately opinionated, with Mei Lin's cheekbones and Eli's gray-green eyes and a disposition that made Mrs. Alderman, called from Caldwell again by Eli on the same dark early morning mission, more practiced this time but no less urgent, say approvingly that this one would give her parents interesting lives. They named her Ruth Hua Cane, and Hua, when the letter arrived in Caldwell, sat down at the kitchen table and cried in a way that she later described as entirely embarrassing and entirely unavoidable. Ruth was not, as predicted, a simple child. She was curious and determined and loud in a way that James was not. And from the beginning, she and her brother established the kind of relationship that siblings develop when they are close in age and genuinely like each other. A permanent mild warfare punctuated by moments of fierce alliance, which seemed to Mei Lin and Eli to be exactly right. The spring of 1883 brought something new. The Santa Fe Railway extended further into southern Kansas, and with it came more settlement, more people, more of the slow civilizing machinery of late 19th century American expansion. The West was changing, had been changing, was always changing, would keep changing, and Caldwell grew, and the roads improved, and the people who had seemed like the permanent fixtures of the frontier turned out to be the first chapter rather than the whole story. Chen expanded the laundry and hired 2 additional workers. Holt's ranch doubled in size. New families came and settled and built, and the open country that had felt like the edge of the known world was acquiring the ordinary infrastructure of the known world. A proper school opened in Caldwell in 1883, a building with 6 windows and a stove, and a teacher named Miss Hartwell who had come from Ohio with a genuine vocation. Mei Lin thought about the school from the moment she heard about it. She rode into Caldwell with Eli on a Thursday morning in September, leaving James and Ruth with Hua, and went to talk to Miss Hartwell, and returned home that evening with the news that she had been offered a position helping Miss Hartwell with the younger children in the afternoons, 3 days a week. Her English was excellent, Miss Hartwell had said, and her facility with both languages was useful, because there were now 3 Chinese families with children in the area who needed a school that could include them. Eli had listened to this with the focused attention he gave everything, and when she had finished, he said, "Do you want to do it?" "Very much," she said. "Then do it," he said, and that was that. And it was one of the moments, there were many of them, distributed across the years, when she thought about how different the world looks when the person beside you simply assumes from the start that you are capable, and that what you want matters. She began at the school in October 1883. She rode in on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday afternoons, leaving the children with Eli on those days. A reversal of the usual domestic arrangement that Eli managed with such uncomplicated naturalness that it made her love him with a sharpness that surprised her even after 4 years. He was patient with Ruth's questioning and with James's quieter requirements and with the general productive chaos of 2 small children. And when she came home in the early evenings, he would have supper ready. Nothing elaborate, he was a practical cook rather than an inspired one, but solid and nourishing and always enough. And they would eat together with the children, and then put them to bed and sit by the fire in the good quiet of the evening and talk about what the day had been. At school, Mei Lin found something she had not known she needed. The children, all of them, not only the Chinese ones, received her with the absolute openness that children have before the world teaches them otherwise, and she taught them their letters and their numbers with a patience and a genuine interest in each child's particular way of understanding things that Miss Hartwell said was a gift, and she believed her. There was a girl named Lucy, the daughter of a new settler from Missouri, who had been terrified of reading until Mei Lin sat with her 3 afternoons in a row and found the particular way into the letters that worked for Lucy's specific mind. And on the day Lucy read her first sentence aloud, slow and triumphant, her finger under each word, Mei Lin felt something in her chest that was entirely its own category of joy. The winter of 1883 was kinder than that of 1879. They had more provisions, better insulation in the cabin. Eli had spent the summer months improving the chinking and adding shutters to the windows, and the routine of the school added a structure to the cold months that made them feel purposeful rather than simply endured. James, who was 3.5 now, had taken to following Eli on his morning chores with the focused, imitative concentration of a small boy who has decided that his father is the most interesting thing in the world, and Eli taught him with careful patience. This is how you check on the horses. This is how you read the wind. This is what you do when the cold comes hard, and you need to think about what the animals need before you think about yourself. Ruth, 18 months and unstoppable, had recently discovered that she could climb most of the furniture in the cabin and was testing this discovery extensively. Christmas of 1883 was the fullest they had had on Mule Creek. Ha and Chen and Daming came for 3 days, and Holt and Nora came on Christmas afternoon. And there were 9 people in the cabin that had been built for 2, and the noise was remarkable, and the warmth was extraordinary. And Eli sat at the head of the table he had built 3 years ago and looked around at all of it. His wife, at the other end of the table, animated in conversation with Hua, her face full and warm and entirely herself. His son next to him, eating with the focused single-mindedness of a small boy at a feast. His daughter on Nora's lap, charming Nora with the efficiency of a child who has learned early that she is charming. Chen, across from him, telling a story that was making Holt laugh. And he put down his fork and sat with it for a moment, the whole warm, full, improbable fact of it. Mei Lin looked up and caught his eye across the table, and she saw what was on his face, and she smiled at him. The full smile, the real one, the one that began in her eyes before it reached her mouth. And he smiled back, and the conversation continued around them, and baby Ruth banged a spoon on the table because she had determined that the spoon was her instrument, and Daming told James something that made James's eyes go wide, and the lamp burned steadily, and the fire was good, and outside the Kansas night was cold and vast and theirs. The years settled into a rhythm that was neither static nor simple, but was deeply, fully alive. Eli built a larger barn in 1884, the cattle operation growing steadily. Not fast, not with the reckless speed of men who over-leveraged and lost everything in a bad season, but steadily and well, which was how Eli did everything. The ranch became known in the area as the Cane Place on Mule Creek, and the name had a quality to it by the mid-1880s that stood for something. Good horses, fair dealing, and the kind of management that took care of the land, because the land was what you were building with and for. Mei Lin continued at the school, and Miss Hartwell, who had become a genuine friend, would ride out to the ranch on Saturdays sometimes and have lunch and talk about the children and about books and about the particular challenges and rewards of teaching in a frontier school. And these afternoons were a pleasure that Mei Lin held as one of the private jewels of her life. She continued to write to her family contacts in San Francisco, maintaining the thread of connection with the Chinese community there, which had become both more complex and more difficult in 1882 when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, a piece of legislation that made Mei Lin's jaw tighten in a specific way when she read about it in the newspaper, and that Eli responded to with a quiet, controlled anger that she recognized as being more dangerous than loudness because it was more certain. "It's wrong," he said, setting down the paper on the evening they read it together. He said it simply, finally, the way he said things that were observable facts of the landscape. "Yes," she said, "it is. It won't stand forever," he said. "I don't know if I believe that," she said. "I do," he said, and looked at her with those direct, clear eyes. Because things don't last when they're built on a wrong foundation. Not eventually. She thought about that for a long time afterward. She was not entirely sure he was right. She had seen enough of the world to know that unjust things can persist for very long periods. But she found she wanted to believe him, and she thought that wanting to believe something good was itself a small form of insistence on a better world. James started school in September 1884 in Miss Hartwell's classroom, and Mei Lin experienced the interesting phenomenon of being both his teacher and his mother 3 days a week, which she managed by simply being what she was in both roles, consistent and present and genuinely interested. And James, for his part, seemed to find this entirely acceptable. He was a careful and quiet student, thorough rather than fast, with a mathematical aptitude that surprised and delighted Miss Hartwell. And he read with the absorbed focus of a child who has been read to every evening of his life by a father with a good reading voice. Ruth started getting into more spectacular trouble as her vocabulary improved and her locomotion became more confident. At 2 years old, she had opinions about nearly everything and expressed them clearly, and the ranch hands who began coming on occasionally to help with the cattle, 2 young men from a neighboring area, solid and good-natured, had learned to treat her with a combination of respect and wariness that Eli found so entertaining he sometimes had difficulty maintaining the serious expression that was his default. "She is going to run something someday," Hua wrote in a letter, after a visit in which Ruth had organized the adults present into what was apparently a reenactment of a cattle drive of her own devising. "Something large, I think. God help it." The summer of 1885 was the summer of the great heat. It came in July and lasted 6 weeks, a sustained punishing heat that dried the creek down to half its usual flow, and turned the grass yellow and made the business of the ranch a daily exercise, in working carefully through the hottest part of the day and conserving water with a discipline that Eli had learned from his time in the mountains and applied now with the same methodical calm. Mei Lin was expecting their third child, which she had told Eli in April, and the pregnancy in the July heat was its own particular endurance, and she did not complain, which Eli therefore worked the harder at making sure the cabin was as cool as it could be managed, hanging wet cloth at the windows and keeping the stove banked low and making sure there was always cold water drawn from the well. He also made sure she ate. The heat had reduced her appetite somewhat, and he was, she noted with a private warmth, entirely alert to this in a way that had never changed, that still had the same careful attention it had had in Weston's restaurant 7 years ago, the same unhurried certainty that she was going to eat a proper meal because it was what she needed, and he was going to make sure of it. Their second son arrived in October 1885, at the end of a long, hard labor, delivered again by Mrs. Alderman, who was, she said, going to need to start charging travel costs to the Cane place on Mule Creek if this pattern continued. They named him Daniel Henry Cane. Henry for no one in particular, simply because it suited him when they saw him, a round-faced, serious infant who looked at the world with an evaluative air from the very first hour. Eli held Daniel the way he had held James and Ruth, with those great careful hands and the particular stillness of a man who understands he is holding something profound. And Mei Lin watched him and felt the accumulation of years, the weight and richness of them, the way that love grows not thinner as it spreads, but deeper, the way that each new thing they had built together made the foundation more solid rather than dividing what was there. 3 children, Mei Lin said from the bed, watching Eli with Daniel. 3 children, he agreed, looking up at her with those eyes, gray-green and warm and entirely certain, as they always were when they looked at her. Are you happy? She asked, not because she did not know the answer, but because she liked hearing it. More than I have words for, he said, simply and absolutely, the only way he ever said anything. The years of the late 1880s built upon each other in the way that good years do, not without difficulty or sorrow, because the West was still the West and the land was still the land, and grief visits everyone, but with an underlying solidity, a sense of genuine construction that is the best thing a life can have. Eli's cattle operation grew to 50 head by 1887, and the ranch that had been a cabin and a dream became a real working property, with a larger barn and a proper bunkhouse for the hands and the cabin itself extended. Eli built a second bedroom for the children in the winter of 1886, working through the cold months with a focused patience. And when it was finished, Mei Lin stood in the doorway of the new room and thought about the cabin as it had been when they arrived, and the distance between then and now felt not like time passed, but like something built. James was 7 in 1887, a serious, thoughtful boy who had inherited his father's physical build and the early signs of what was going to be considerable size, and his mother's precision of thought, and who had also, apparently, inherited some specific combination of their natures that made him deeply patient with his younger siblings. Ruth was 5 and going to school now, and her teacher, Miss Hartwell's replacement, a young woman named Miss Barnes, who had arrived in 1886 when Miss Hartwell married and moved to Wichita, had written a note home in October 1887 saying that Ruth was the most intellectually engaged student she had ever taught, and also, she said with apparent genuine affection, the most challenging. Daniel at 2 was still round and serious and increasingly mobile, with a gift for getting into things that were closed and a capacity for silence that Mei Lin found occasionally alarming and eventually understood was simply the way he processed the world. Mei Lin turned 35 in the winter of 1887, and she sat on the evening of her birthday in the warm kitchen with the children in bed and Eli across the table with his hands around his coffee and the fire steady in the stove. And she thought about all of it, from the train station in Caldwell, the single trunk, the borrowed dress too large, the particular hollow way she'd been in those months after Way died, and the distance between that woman and this one was so great that it seemed to belong to a different story, except that it didn't. It was all one story. It was all one life. "What are you thinking about?" Eli asked. He always asked because he had always been genuinely interested in what she was thinking, and 7 years of marriage had not changed this. About Caldwell, she said. About the train. He nodded, remembering. About the first steak at Weston's, she said with a small smile. The best steak in Kansas, he said with perfect seriousness. I don't know about that, she said. I told you, he said. Good cut, Friday delivery. She laughed. You told me I was going to eat it regardless of my opinion. I told you that you should come, he said. There's a difference. There was not much difference, she said, and he smiled. That rare, real, entirely unguarded smile. And she thought that this was what happiness looked like when it was allowed to become a permanent condition rather than a temporary state. Not the sharp, breathless happiness of beginnings, but the deep, warm happiness of things built well over time, of knowing someone so thoroughly that their presence in a room is the same as the room being right, of reaching across a table in the firelight and finding a hand that has always been there and will always be there. She reached across the table. He took her hand, both of his wrapped around hers, the way it had always been, the way it would always be. Outside, the Kansas night was clear and cold and enormous, the stars impossibly bright over the open prairie, and the cottonwoods along Mule Creek were bare and dark against the winter sky, and the land went on in every direction, vast and patient and full of the slow promise of spring. Inside, the fire was warm. The children were sleeping. The lamp burned steadily. Eli Cane looked across the table at his wife, the woman who had stepped off a train in Caldwell with her grief and her silence and her impossible beauty, the woman who had accepted his coffee and then his dinner, and then, gradually and on her own terms, his heart, and held her hand in the firelight and felt the fullness of everything they had made together settle around him like good stone, like deep roots, like the solid, certain weight of a life worth every single day of its building. And Mei Lin looked back at him, at the man who had walked into a steam-filled laundry in October 1878 and simply refused, with extraordinary gentleness and absolute certainty, to allow her to disappear. And she felt the deep, abiding gratitude and love of a woman who has been found when she was not looking and kept when she did not yet know she needed keeping, and who has built from that finding a life so full and real and warm that it leaves no room for anything less. The fire crackled and settled. The creek ran under its ice. The children breathed in their sleep. And the night went on around the small warm light of the cabin on Mule Creek, that good light visible from a long way off across the open Kansas country, burning steady and sure against the dark.